thank you, first of all, for making such a brilliant film. I related to it far more than I expected to. And I wanted really to begin with the central character and the central performance, so beautifully done by Bilal, of Layla themselves. There are a lot of autobiographical overlaps between you and Layla. I think it's worth naming that elephant in the room. Layla is, an Arab, is a drag queen, is non-binary, but there are also differences as well between the two of you. I joked that Layla has self-respect, but that would be mean to say on stage. Oh, I did. But there are differences, fundamentally between the two of you. So obviously there are autobiographical elements in the construction of this character. Could you talk a little bit about how the character came about and what you drew on for Layla?
Thank you for that. Well, a window into probably how little respect I had for myself. In the first draft, Layla died in the first 10 minutes. So yeah, it was in a bad place when I first pitched the project. I guess when I was writing Layla or thinking about Layla, I think I am someone who grew up sort of as a survival mechanism, needing lots of different selves in order to survive. And often it had been commented by my friends, wow, you were so confident at that party and now you're just a shell at this one, and you were so different when I saw you with your mum, this sort of constantly self-contradictory person. And I don't think people realize that that's sort of a trauma response, this need to constantly modify in order to survive in different spaces. And so I was really thinking about my own kind of contradictory nature, maybe is to say, or thinking about the way that I changed quite a lot, and I was trying to just put that down on paper. And I think when I started writing the film, I wanted Layla to be a beguiling character who you meet as someone hyper-confident on stage and then completely sort of emotionally not forthcoming in their romantic relationships, to different with their family, and allow the audiences to build their own idea of who Layla actually is. And it changes in my mind when I now watch the film, getting a grasp of who they actually are.
Yeah, and I think one thing that really struck me when I saw the film the first time was the fact that Layla isn't a perfect victim. In fact, we talked a little bit about how they, not only get things wrong, but actually sometimes behave in ways that are chaotic, even cruel. Thinking particularly of their relationship with their sister. And I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, so my impression of that relationship with their sister is that it's almost easier to tell this lie, oh, my sister wants nothing to do with me. But in fact, they have become so accustomed to compartmentalizing, and the fear of integrating different parts of their lives is so powerfully dominant in their psyche that they're actually, perhaps they grew up needing to tell lies, and now they don't know where the truth begins and the lies end. That was my interpretation. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I was doing. It's just as deep and profound as you just said, so thank you. Well, yeah, I definitely think a lot of queer people of color I know, they live in this sense where they've had to compartmentalize or divide themselves as a means to survive. And then it becomes like a nervous system trauma response where it's just easier to live in that way and not integrate anything, because I suppose when you were younger, the kind of cost of that could be so profound. And so it's just second nature to Layla. But I guess in terms of Layla, I was really tired of a lot of narratives, queer narratives, where I suppose there is a version of this film where Layla's a sort of weak victim drag queen, and they meet this kind of gorgeous hot hunk who is the powerful dominant one. And I do think there are a lot of more kind of straight audience leaning queer films where a character like Layla might be more of a victim and not have agency in their decision making. And queer people obviously are, as we know, many chaotic, annoying ones. Yeah, there you go. I'm glad you saw yourself in that response. And I'm annoying, as you've told me before. So no, but I think this idea of Layla being an agent of their own chaos, and I think there's a certain, when it comes to their sister, and the reason that was a really difficult thing to get right was, you know, there's also a sense of what lies you tell for who. And I think in that scene when they're in bed with Max and he's sort of in awe of Layla because, you know, they're an Arab drag queen who's not in touch with the sister, it's basically giving him a boner, and Layla, you know, wants to self-fetishize because it's kind of hot for the white guy to be dealing with this orphaned Arab who he can save. And so, but it's not Max's look, it's not Max doing that, it's Layla self-fetishizing in order to please Max. And I don't think Max ever really makes Layla do anything. Layla just, I like to think Layla's an agent of their own destruction. And I think in a lot of queer films I'd seen that things happen to queer people a lot. And that's just not how life works, I don't think.
No, I agree. And I want to come back to Max because I found Max such an interesting figure and how the narrative of the film is built around him as well. But I guess before that, I just want to talk a bit more generally, give you the opportunity to talk a bit more generally about, I guess, the tone of the film, because it does feel like it almost is a medley of different genres. And I think, I don't know, yeah, that can always be quite queer in itself, that there is elements of comedy, there are elements of tragicomedy. For you, you know, was that something you always wanted to do, was to integrate kind of a different, you know, to have a shift between different tones and genres within the same feature?
Yeah, it's actually something we like really battled with at script stage with different reads and had lots of engaging conversations about, because, you know, there are people who are like, wait, is this a rom-com or is it a coming-of-age story? Are we more in a drama space? But, you know, I'm a drag queen and have been for a long time, and you know, the way that we work is we sort of just pillage whatever we can see from mass culture and just then reformulate it and make it our own thing. You know, drag queens are like kind of Robin Hoods. They just sort of find anything from pop culture and will take whatever works for whatever moment to create something really powerful for that moment. And so in the sense that Layla as a character is a sort of code switcher and shifts who they are in order to please whoever they are, the way that we started talking about the film and the writing process, but also just visually was, well, let's just let the tone of the film mirror that queer ability to sort of code switch and just change in an instant. And, you know, it borrows there's a lot in the film that it's kind of intentionally a bit tacky or kitsch, and it's kind of, I love Warhol for doing that, and I think I just sort of wanted to kind of pay homage to the queer tradition of just taking whatever you can find wherever it is and reformulating it for whatever moment serves that moment best, if that makes sense. Yeah. Cool, sorry. Oh. Did I all offend you with that response? Yeah, sorry, you nodded, okay, cool.
I was interested as well about, like, even in the filming of interiors and people's homes, I felt like one of the sort of strong themes or touch points in the film was like this idea of homecoming and where is Layla's home. And that's like quite a literal question in that she moves around between different interiors quite often. And there's the family home, and then there's the home, which ultimately they return to the home that they had at the beginning, which is with their friends, although that's a home that's sort of under siege in community. And, you know, then there's that kind of very grayscale, borderline American Psycho home that Max lives in. And to me, yeah, it seems like there is this, you know, search for a home for someone that hasn't perhaps found one, but ultimately realizes that it sounds very Dorothy in the Wizard of Oz, they were home all along. Yeah. And yeah, I was wondering what you thought about that and about how you wanted to kind of, you know, how the visuals represent that kind of search, because there are quite starkly different, you know, visual imagery throughout the film.
Yeah, I think we sometimes say that the film itself is like a drag queen, and we definitely wanted every space to be like a drag interpretation of what that space could be. You know, I think Max's flat is what a drag queen assumes a cis white guy lives in. It's not genuinely, I mean, I would actually prefer to live there because I'm sure it has less asbestos than the commune. But, you know, love the commune. And, you know, and I don't think a group of, you know, young queer POC people could afford that place. So we invented a sort of drag interpretation of what each home might represent. We didn't kind of want them to feel like literal spaces, to sort of, in the way that drag kind of, through creating a fantasy, also reveals the architecture of the fantasy. I think by giving every space such an exaggerated kind of camp wink in the aesthetic, we were kind of trying to hint at the idea that home doesn't really exist in these physical spaces. Yeah. But, you know, in Layla, being able to combine all of who they are. And the final space, which is the sort of space odyssey blue room, I'll call it that, that's actually like the design of a mosque, but through a queer lens, and it's sort of like a home as well. And I think actually when Layla's spinning and everything's just combining together, that's probably when they feel most at home. But that's also an invented space. So I think queer people of color like Layla are so nomadic in the way that they live. Finding a kind of physical home may actually be an impossibility, and I definitely don't have one myself. I wouldn't know where I would. If someone said, "Where's home for you?" I don't really know the answer to that. So it has to come from inside, and so that's why we try to exaggerate physical space to show how it's not able to house the idea of home, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. One other thing I had to ask about was the broader casting, because one thing that's so incredible about this film is I have never seen that representation of modern queer London, and particularly, you know, like the black and brown led side of queer London. So it's like a subculture within a subculture within a subculture that feels familiar to me, and then quite literally half of our friends were kept popping up as extras.
Yeah, supporting artists, Shon, supporting artists.
So I was wondering, about constructing that world, because I've never seen that on, you know, in a feature-length film on a big screen, about how you constructed that world, and about how you went looking, because you obviously cast people who actually belong to these scenes.
Yeah, and you know, and again, we were talking about a kind of like melding mass culture with, you know, art house. And some, you know, we liked borrowing, you know, Marina and the Diamonds and Agnes Release Me, and then also finding sort of using our friends like Tom Rasmussen, who's an incredible queer singer whose second album, Live Wire, you must listen to, and they're playing at Coco on Friday, plug. And casting actors, and then also friends and just people I met on Instagram. And I think the film, but I suppose we also wanted, again, a place like Feathers sadly doesn't exist in London as a club for queer POC only. And so part of this film was to sort of create a London we wish existed. Yeah.
As we've sort of spoken about casting, I think it is worth talking a bit about Max. And, you know, when I saw the screening at Curzon, Louis, who plays Max, was there, and you said to him about how his performance, I think it's such a strong one, and you said that it was somewhat different to what you might have envisioned at the beginning. And one of the things that struck me about the character of Max, and also the way that Louis plays it, is that that character could have easily been like a one-note villain, whereas in fact, I had quite a lot of empathy for Max. It also reminded me of quite a lot of exes of mine, like who like seems very lost and somewhat covetous of Layla's freedom. And I thought that actually, you know, to me, I often felt like this was someone in their own kind of chains. And I think that was played very empathetically. Could you talk a little bit like about how you made that character a bit more two-dimensional? And there's often sometimes actually Layla is they sort of, the power play between them, we're going to get to the shoe, the power play between them is, you know, switches more than you might expect.
Well, yeah, there is a version, and that's probably the earlier version of the film when we like pitched it so long ago, was where Max was a sort of Abercrombie jock, Prince Charming, and Layla was just sort of like a wistful drag queen who would do anything for his approval. And that sort of changed the more we developed it. And then when we started casting it, and we had an amazing casting director, Shaheen Baig, we brought loads of kind of tapes in, and when we saw those more jockey Abercrombie boys, it just flattened the film. It just made it about these 2D trope. And part of whether it's successful or not, but part of, I think, the trick of a film, I mean, you need the audience, the conclusion not to be too foregrounded. And I thought if Max was too sort of like a toxic jock, you just want Layla to break up with him right from the beginning. And I actually think they've got really great chemistry, and that Max is really likable, and that he's really trying to get to know Layla, but Layla's self, is deceiving him a lot of the time. So it's actually, Layla's like a moving target, and it's hard. And I think Max has good intentions. He also has his issues. And so, no offense to Louis, who's not an Abercrombie jock, but, perfect in his own way. On the inside. No, I'm kidding.
I feel so bad for the way that you've said this.
Well, oh God, I'm going to get cancelled. I had 2 beers, which is a lot for me, by the way. What are we talking about?
The shoe.
But Louis just, you just sort of need them to be a good couple.
Yeah.
And I think if you lean too much into the tropes of the pre-expectations, I think it will just take you out of the relationship because you're just seeing the externality too much.
Yeah.
And I think Max is actually, again, we didn't want him to be too mask we can talk about that now, I suppose, the shoe.
I've been pushing for this. No, I mean, well, let's get into that very, very quickly. I guess, it was one of the more surprising scenes in the film. I actually thought the entire film's attitude towards sexuality, because it's interesting when watching, anything that enters the mainstream about queerness, about whether or not it's going to retain sexuality, because that can still be quite controversial on screen. And I think this film really does retain that. And then, what interested me was I had interpreted that sex scene with him getting fucked by the shoe. There's no polite way to say that. About his own craving for femininity and for a kind of powerful femininity that that Layla represents, to him in a certain way, and that Layla wants to give that to him, literally, and that there's a message there, a core message, a metaphor about how femininity isn't what you expect, how it can be powerful, and then that plays out sexually, as it so often does, and that I don't know if that was the correct interpretation. I did notice that later on they have a discussion about seeing a film, and then Max is like, well, that was a great metaphor, and then Layla is like, that's basic of you. So maybe I'm being really basic. Yeah. Could you talk a little bit more about sexuality in the film and, about what you were trying to perhaps explain about femininity or your understanding of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that cinema scene afterwards is kind of talking about the tradition of queer cinema. But I remember in this room, actually, in 2017, I'd met Savannah that year through the BFI Flair mentorship program. We were watching loads of queer films, and we were watching this film called Body Electric, which is a really beautiful queer Brazilian film by Marcelo Caetano, whose second film, Baby, was just at LFF. And in that film, all the drag queens and trans characters and femmes have great sex. And I'd never seen it before, and I was just crying. And it's not a sad film at all. I mean, it's quite a joyous film, and Savannah was like looking over, like, I think maybe I'd eaten too much of my edible, but that was not what was happening. It was just like, I was just so like, oh, I've not seen femmes have great, hot, powerful sex. The drag queen in a film is usually like the asexual eunuch who, smokes at a cigarette, peels off her eyeliner, and just, tells the cis gays like a good one-liner, and they can go fuck, and then she retreats to her, boudoir. And so I was just like, I want to see hot femme sex, and the heel was a kind of a symbol of that. And also, in that bit of the film, everyone can have their own interpretation, so I want you to take what you will from it. But I think Layla's been having to suppress their femininity around Max at that point of the film, and it's just a way to put it back in to the relationship. Thank you. Yeah, Kobe Yates is really remarkable, and you know, it's funny, we did talk to a lot of costume designers, and when we told some the budget, they were like, ran away crying. But it took, you know, someone from the community who understood drag to go, okay, actually we can take whatever we get and just create a fantasy. And you know, some of those costumes are made in the most inventive ways. And whether or not they're a drag costume, I think every costume in the film we wanted to be a bit kitsch and you know, everything is a drag queen's interpretation of what that kind of person might wear. So I think that's how we approach the costume. Yeah, and we know designers. Well, I have an octopus tattoo here. Well, I'm just like weirdly, I kind of hate having to explain this. The genius metaphor and what's behind it. I think like, I love octopuses because they remind me of how a queer person of color is sort of on their own sometimes, and they can camouflage really quickly and code switch really quickly. And they also have many tentacles that are wrestling with each other, but they also work in harmony. And that's how I sort of see Layla, as this sort of solo code switcher person trying to get their tentacles to spin. And they eventually do, though octopuses live 2 years, and I hope Layla has a lovely life.
And I think we might actually...
Are we done?
Yeah,
okay.
we have to.
Thank you all so much.
Amrou Al-Kadhi.
Thank you, Shon. Thank you.